Good evening, everyone. I want to welcome you to the Wyandotte County Museum, to our latest Thursday evenings at the museum presentation. We have a few announcements before we get started. So one of the big ones is we've got coming up in November, we have our annual gun raffle. We'll be drawing the winning tickets on Veterans Day, November 11th, during our Veterans program. So if you haven't got tickets, I have them up here, and Woody will not let you out the door unless you've got one. Then we've got, next week, I'm going to be doing another Thursday evening presentation on the Celery King murder. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with that, the murder of William Johnson, but it had a huge impact on the way some of the court cases and trials are held today. So I'll talk a little bit that, so that's your kind of teaser to have to come back next week to know why that's a very important case. And then on the 21st, we'll be doing our annual Oak Hill Cemetery walks, 1:30 and 3 o'clock. No cost to attend, just show up, we'll meet like we have in the past at the little maintenance shed, and then walk, take about an hour walk around the cemetery. And we try to do a leisurely path, through, so it's not too strenuous, but we will deviate a little bit to talk about some of the cemetery markings, some of the people buried there. And then, as I said, our Veterans Day program is coming up November 10th and 11th. I'll talk more about that next week, but Bonnie's kind of hiding behind me, so she's got a program to talk about.
Okay, he's going to be my Vanna White here. Okay. I'm going to talk about the fashion show that's going to be here on Friday evening, December 15th from 5 to 7. And it's not a traditional fashion show where you sit down and the models come in and twirl around. The models will be wandering through the crowd that evening. And they will have on clothing from the museum here, from our textile collection, or from the arts collection, or we have some participating boutiques, Southern Accents from Marion, Papillon from Findlay, and Threads in Tiffin, and Creekside here in Upper, and Color Me Unique here in Upper. And we're going to have local women be modeling. In fact, we have a model sitting right there. Belinda's going to generously said that she'd be one of our models. Cheryl's going, yes. Cheryl, she's my hero. She volunteered to be a model. She's going to model some stuff here from our textile collection. So it should be lots of fun. It'll be a mocktail party. We're not allowed to serve alcohol on the premises, but it'll be fun. We'll have some raffle prizes, and it'll be a fun evening. So you can buy tickets ahead of time. We're asking for a $10 donation, or you can buy them at the door. It should be just a fun evening, and you can come and go as you wish. We're open from 5 to 7, but you can come from 5:30 to 6 or whatever you want. Okay, that's a lot of fun.
Question about that. Will the
Yes.
Christmas trees still be up?
Yes, and that's why we're having the fashion show then, because the backdrop will be so festive.
Nice.
Good question.
Nice.
Yes. Oh, we have the tickets here. Compliments of my husband Tom made these tickets. They're collector's items, Only $10 for a collector's item. So anyway, it'll be lots of fun.
Thank you, Bonnie.
Yes.
So I guess I get a change from the curator to now I'm going to introduce our director, Ron Marvin, to speak about his trip.
Oh, I forgot that.
Thank you, Bonnie.
I got too excited about the fashion show.
So, Quay, which any of you have talked to the Wyandottes, that's a hello, welcome. So this is a little bit about my trip out to Oklahoma and Kansas to spend some time with the Wyandottes and the Delaware. This was a trip that was literally several years in the making. We were looking, it was actually authorized in May of 16, May 2016. Former board member Dan Shields made the motion, but the problem was we were in the process, we were in and out of having a curator up at the Overland Inn, so there really was no one to kind of cover for me during that entire week. So we finally got Sarah here on board in 2019, so we thought we'd go out in 2020. Well, we know what that happened. It got postponed 21, 22. Finally, this spring when we were going through everything, the board said, you're going to Oklahoma. We don't care. And we'll find someone to cover for you. We'll make sure. So I was able to go out in the middle of June. And so this is a little bit about my travel log. So I won't be quite as bad as when you remember going to your grandparents and they brought out the slide carousel and they went through the trip they took. And so I don't have 100 slides, but it's going to seem like that. So I'm going to try to go through some of them as quick as possible. And so to start out, I started out at taking the I-70 and I-44 out west. So I was one of those, I had a friend, she was like, I want you to document everything. So when I stopped at, the Plainsville Rest Area, the local garden club had actually made this really nice scene. And then being a veteran, driving along the Blue Star Memorial Highway, which I always work with the local Blue Star Brothers chapter over in Kenton. So this meant a lot. So this was going through Indiana. So I was out going through, and being a Civil War buff, I was driving by, and just about 6 miles off of the road in Missouri was the Wilson's Creek battlefield. And at first I drove by and I'm like, you know what? I'm never going to get here before. So I turned around and went back there, and I literally spent about 2 hours driving around the battlefield. So the visitor center has a period cannon, and then they have the mannequins all set up. There was a lot of information in here about the Civil War, the Wilson's Creek battlefield, which was the second major battle in the war, April 10th, and had the first Union General Lyons that was killed during the battle. So I spent some time in there driving around the cemetery. Driving around the battlefield. They have several embankments of cannons showing where the Southerners set up and where the Northerners. And there was actually a creek running through it where it gets its name, Wilson's Creek. The Ray family went to bed at night in their homestead, woke up the next morning to cannon fire. The mother took the children down into the basement. When they came back up 3 hours later, they found that their house had been taken over and it was now a Confederate hospital. And the master bedroom had General Nathaniel Lyons had been captured, and he was taken there, and that became his deathbed. So I spent a few hours there. Since I was driving out, I didn't have, it was about a 12-hour drive straight to Oklahoma, so I drove about halfway, so I had plenty of time to stop and kind of doing tourist stuff. So just outside the little town of Republic, found this really cool concrete ampersand with it just painted all kinds of images on. So you see, different towns have birds or doors or other things. So that part of Missouri just had these concrete ampersands with all kinds of interesting stuff. So I continued along the highway and found the circus sideshow, the Fudge Factory. It was this little town, a really tourist trap town, had a little city jail and had a rocket ship from one of the old 1960s rocket ships. And so they did have an alien out there in a UFO on the property. And so I went through, I found the Circus Sideshow Museum. So being a museum person, I decided to go in, had all kinds of these banners hanging like you would find in the circus. So the Fort Leonard Wood Garboon, and then Mr. and Mrs., the bearded lady, her husband, which this would have been a lot better in the dark. I guess this is where you paid your penny or your nickel in the circus to go in and see. So they had an electric chair there. So the Black Widow, not to be confused with Scarlett Johansson in the Marvel. So, and then you obligatory selfie with the giant skeleton. So that was a fun little diversion that took me out of my way out there. So while I was there, they also had the world's largest belt buckle. 13 by 10 foot, 13 foot across and 10 foot down. It's actually a working belt buckle. So if you were to go on the back side of this, it has the loop and everything. Now I want to see the world's largest belt to put it on.
Yeah.
So I left there kind of excited, a little confused, but yeah, but they had a nice little gift shop and a little snack bar and stuff. So that was a couple hour diversion. Then I went on down into Oklahoma to go to the Wyandot reservation, where I was going to spend a few days in the hotel there. So I had lots of people staring at me as the guy with the Ohio plates getting out, taking pictures of the signs entering Wyandot Nation, exiting Wyandot Nation. And it was like everybody was wondering who the strange guy was running around town taking pictures. So, but the Wyandot Nation, that is their jurisdictional area. They don't refer to it as a reservation, it's their tribal jurisdiction area. They are in the county of Ottawa, Oklahoma, which is not much bigger than the size of Wyandotte County. And that is where 9 of the traditional Ohio tribes now reside. So to give you kind of an equivalent, if you think the towns of Upper Sandusky, Cary, Nevada, Sycamore, Mexico, Marseilles, Wharton, those would all be a different Indian nation. So that gives you an idea of the size of the towns and the area that they cover. So it doesn't take long to go from one area to another. So I went into the Wyandot Nation, had no idea where I was going. I just knew I had the directions to get to the Riverbend Hotel and Casino. So the first thing when I pull into town, I see this little sign that says Wyandot Nation. So I'm thinking, that's the administrative building. Well, it used to be until they built the new one about 10 years ago. That is now the police station, and it also has the community library and the preschool. And they had a cafeteria in there. They do like a Meals on Wheels for all of their elders, where they make the lunches and breakfast for them and take them out and deliver them in their homes. And so I stopped and I noticed some people wandering in. I didn't necessarily want to go in the police station and ask for directions, although I was getting eyeballed by the tribal police. So I went into where they were making the meals and just explained who I was. And they were kind of excited that, somebody from Wyandot, Ohio was out in Wyandot, Oklahoma. So they explained to me how to get to the administration building and everything. However, since it was after 5 o'clock, everybody was gone. So I went and I checked into the hotel. And so when I was heading out there, unfortunately Chief Wren was going to be heading up to Minnesota for a gaming conference. And he said, I probably wouldn't be there while the days that you were there. So I took this picture of the Riverbend Casino sign, put it on my Facebook page and said, guess where? And Chief's response was, and the one day that I'm not in town. So if you're not familiar with the Riverbend Casino, when you go into it and you're facing, like this doorway would be the main entrance. So all the hotel is off to the right and the casino is off to the left. When I pulled in, there were cars with plates from Arkansas, Missouri, Oklahoma, Kansas, California, a lot of people traveling. I had to wait in line to check in behind a couple from Germany that had flown in for the day, and just so they could say that they gamed in the Wyandot Casino, and then they were going up to the Shawnee and the casino the next day. But the restaurant is actually located just inside the casino. So you have to go through and they have you get a gaming card to play the slot machines and everything. And that card also allows you to pay your meal or get a percentage off of your meal. So yes, I did spend a few hours in the casino, but I set myself a limit. I put like $20 on the card, and once it was gone, I just went back up to the room and relaxed for the rest of the night. So, spent the first night there after the meal and everything, got up the next day, and just took a drive around trying to familiarize myself. So, the little town of Wyandot, not to be confused with the tribal facilities, this is separate. This is the little town of Wyandotte, Oklahoma. So as you head in there, so there's the Wyandotte tribal jurisdiction area, and then within that is the town of Wyandotte. So this is their fire station. Back behind it is a bank, and then off to the side over here is the elementary school and the high school, which they weren't necessarily pleased with someone from Ohio driving around the schools, taking pictures, but I did stop at the ball field and the football field, so we could probably be here another 2 hours if I showed you all the pictures I took from out there. But once I explained who I was, it got to be just like it is around here when I go out to the cemetery. It's like, oh, it's that weird museum guy from Ohio. So I just drove around, got back in. This is the new Wyandotte Nation Administrative Building. This is where Chief Friend's offices are. So I went in there and asked to talk to, if the second chief was there, or someone could tell me, how to get to the Wyandotte Cultural Center and Museum. The poor girl was going to laugh at me because she said, right across the parking lot is the museum. Said, all you had to do is go up to the next building. So I went there. Second Chief Hildebrand was not in, but they were able to call over to the Wyandotte Museum and let them know I was there. So I went over. So this is the outside of the Wyandotte Nation Cultural Center Museum. Right back in here is their garden and cooking area, which we'll see in a little bit. So I went over there and I met the people, Kim Garcia and a couple others, and they introduced me to Joshua Garcia. Josh is one of the cultural heritage specialists there, and he's the one that took me around and gave me a tour of the museum, talked to me quite a bit about Wyandotte culture. This is a couple pictures I found online. This is when he was recently out at Fort Recovery in August. They always come back to Ohio and teach about Wyandotte. This is him in his formal regalia. He just recently came back from Riyadh, Saudi Arabia with the group from the Ohio History Connection. He was one of 8 tribal members that went over as part of the delegation for the Ohio's Hopewell Ceremonial Earthworks. If you're familiar with them, down at Mound City, and a couple others down in southern Ohio, they are now a UNESCO World Heritage Site. So it's the first one in Ohio and only the 25th one in the United States. So if you've ever been to the Statue of Liberty or the Grand Canyon, you've been to a UNESCO Heritage Site. So this is along the lines of Cahokia as far as being prehistoric in Ohio. So I got to meet and talk to Josh quite a bit. Their building is actually built around a circle in the center. The circles are very prominent in Wyandotte culture because they would always sit around the circles, sort of like King Arthur's ideas that they would all be equal. So the circle was quite a bit. So they built the center, and it has all of these panels. And this is a poster board that they would pass out, and this is what all the panels are around the side. So it starts out with the history of the Wyandottes, how the earth was formed, and it goes all the way up to the Seneca Indian School, which is now where most of the Wyandotte administration buildings are, where the Museum and Cultural Center was actually the superintendent's home. on the Seneca Indian School. And they said if you look along the tree line there's a lot of bumps and things where as things were no longer used, they would just throw off into the woods and their debris piles. And he said there's more than likely an unknown cemetery out there, but they did not want to try to excavate to see if there were any the students. So they have a marker on the site commemorating the Seneca Indian School. So one of the things that I learned that I wasn't aware of from talking with Josh was, Josh took me around, can't quite see it on this panel, but on the big poster that I showed, there's the darker black spot that has all of the animals that are the traditional spirit animals for the Wyandottes. He said the one thing that we never do in the spring and summer is talk about our origin story. We never talk about the animals because they are awake and we don't want to offend them. We wait until the winter when they are sleeping, when they're hibernating. That's when we talk about the deer and the bear and the beaver. And he said, so that was something that I wasn't aware of, something that I could take back. Just, and I know when we have our school tours, they're usually in the spring and they talk about the origin story. That is something they do not do in Oklahoma. So they would have the students come through like in late August, early winter, and that's when they sit down and talk about the origin stories of the Wyandottes. And it goes through, it talks about a lot of the clothing and the customs. So, you know, here's a picture of what a traditional Wyandot would look like. And he said, it's not what you think of the traditional buckskin wearing Indian. He said it doesn't look anything like the stereotypical Plains Indian. He said, so it's very, very different, the depictions of how the Wyandottes were, he said. And they came down here in the 1600s, he said, and came into the Ohio Territory into the 1700s. And early on, they met a lot of traders, primarily French traders, and it wasn't long before they started adopting a lot of European customs. And when they left Ohio, and even the ones that came down from Michigan, there were literally no full-blooded Wyandots. They had married in so much. And that was something I learned early on from talking with Chief Friend, that the four primary families of the Wyandottes are the Armstrongs, Zanes, Walkers, and Browns. So Chief Friend is actually descended from Adam Brown, who was a white boy that was captured in Detroit and lived up in the Michigan reservation. And then a lot of you know the story of Robert Armstrong, the Armstrong family here in Upper Sandusky. William Walker, who then went out with them to Kansas. William Walker Jr. was one of the first Indian agents, and we'll see him a little bit more, the Walker pop up, and I'll explain why that's important. And then Chief Tarhay's daughter Myra married Isaac Zane. And if you've been around the area at Zanesfield, the Zane Caverns area, that's the Zanes that are today are descended from them. So it was quite a bit. And one of the things that he taught me out there is he said, he showed me how to do the traditional arrow fletching, where we would think of them just attaching the whole arrow onto the feathers onto the back of the arrows. And he said there was a very particular way that they cut them and fashioned them. And so he sat there and showed me how to do it. And when they traditionally did it, they used sinew. And so they would cut the strips, and to keep them moist, they would just be chewing on this leather the whole time, just to keep it moist. And that way, when it dried, it became very thick. So it was really interesting. He showed me a lot of the stuff in the museum. We talked about the longhouse. There were actually 2 rooms that were in the museum that I was not allowed to go into because I was not a tribal citizen. That's where they kept a lot of the records. But he showed me some of the wampum belts and other things that they had in their collection. we went outside to the garden, and they were just starting. In May, they had planted the corn for the three sisters, which the corn would grow up, and then they would plant beans along it to run up, and then squash on the ground. We tried to replicate that out here, but the squirrels liked it too much. Theirs is in an enclosure, which is very difficult for the animals to get into. They said this particular strain of corn would grow to about 14 feet high. They said once it gets above your head, that's when you start to plant the beans. And then when the beans grow up to eye level, then you start stripping the beans, because otherwise they'll just keep going up. So they also, in this garden, they had two other beds. One was their ceremonial tobacco, which I did not take a photograph of, just because I thought it was inappropriate. They also had some sweetgrass and some rope wood, some other ceremonial pieces that they grow to be used in their traditional ceremonies during their powwow. So even though I didn't get a photograph of those, I listened to Josh tell me the stories. And this was actually the second batch of tobacco that they had raised. Chris Hauk, who was their cultural specialist, the other one, he had actually harvested some tobacco earlier. So when they go to ceremonials like a burial or they go into a new building, they then use some of that tobacco as offerings. So it wasn't really meant to be smoked, it was more for an offering. So went into the little museum, and here I'm going in thinking it's this great big museum, I'm going to find rooms and rooms. Most of it is the traditional cultural center. They have about 6 rooms that are teaching rooms, where they teach like beadwork or pottery or moccasin making, or they sit down and they tell stories. And so it's more a workshop building. So they had one room that basically had all of their exhibits in it. And it was maybe about half the size of this room.
Wow.
So it just had a series of these handmade wooden cases that lined the wall, and so I took a few. Again, I said if I showed you all the pictures, we'd be here quite a bit. But so they had the wampum belts, and they explained a little bit about they had a display about the wampum shells and how the shells, the quahog, or the purple in the shell is the only thing they use to get the bright colors for the wampum belts. So I got a whole course on that, crash course from Chris and Josh about making the wampum belts. Traditional trade crafts that they had there. There's again some examples of the wampum belts. And for those of you that were here in September of 2019 when they transferred the Mission Church to the Wyandottes, they actually made a separate belt. So this is representative of the Wyandottes with the wampum, and then here is the Methodist, the cross representing the church, and that's the transfer of it. So we were always taught, at least I heard growing up, the wampum belts were their money. And it wasn't really the wampum was money. The wampum belts told the stories, but the individual beads in there could have value because they would trade the beads to each other. But it was primarily the white of the shell and then the purple of the shell. They didn't traditionally use anything else. So when I heard the name Quahog, the first thing that came to my mind was the Silly Little Town and Family Guy, the TV show. So it was kind of interesting to see where they got their items from. This corner showed some of their pots for cooking corn. So I got a whole big course on how to make Wyandot hominy. And the reason why the corn that we eat today is non-digestible versus the traditional corn, the hominy that the Wyandottes and the Delaware and the Shawnee make. He said, that's what, they ate them and they could eat the entire thing just because of the different method of preserving. So we went out to the fire pit and he showed me a lot of the clay pots and how almost all of the pots all have a curved base. He said almost none of them have a flat base on it because they would build a fire and they would sit the pot down in the middle of the fire. And so the fire would be able to get around. So examples of some of the squash and some of the other foods that they preserve. So he said, Josh, as we were walking there, he goes, you want to try something different? He said, I've got one jar left that I've been kind of hoarding. And so we went into the little kitchen area and he pulled out this little mason jar that was about half full. And he said, have you ever tried black walnut syrup? He said, well, Wyandots made maple syrup when they were in Ohio. There are no maple trees in Kansas or Oklahoma. He said, but there were black walnut trees. Somebody figured out around 2016 the technique of making syrup out of the walnuts. So I was able to try a little spoonful of that. And it is not sweet at all. It has kind of a buttery taste to it. But this had a really smoky flavor because they boil it down in ash. And so it really takes on the taste and the aroma of the wood that it's being burned on.
But are they tapping the black walnut trees?
Yes,
like
he
you
said-
do the maple? Okay.
Yeah, he said there is a very particular time, usually in February, where it gets down to freezing and then it goes back up to around 50. He said that gets the sap flowing through the trees,
Yeah.
so there's only about a 2 or 3 day window when they can actually tap the trees. And so on our driving tour, they took me by the little stand of black walnut trees that they were using, that they were growing just to make the syrup. So it was something that I never heard of and I'd never seen anywhere, black walnut syrup. He said, this was I think that it was a 2021 vintage because the 2022 didn't set proper. They said, so this is all we have left, but they wanted to share it with me, so that was kind of an honor to have that. So, on the back wall is all kinds of pictures of different Wyandots through the eras. And so you see Mother Solomon up top, and so this was some of the earliest members, and then as you go through some of the more modern. And then this was a quilt they made that has the 12 clans. And they really weren't familiar with who the 12 clans were until the 1970s when Chief Cotter tried to recapture the history of the Wyandots, and that's when they started working with Delma Marsh. And they learned about the 12 animal clans, and they kind of helped to recapture. And the traditional images that we use today of those animal clans are based on a quilt that was sewn in the 1970s for the Wyandots. That was sort of based on traditional sketches, but they had lost so much of the culture over time that they really didn't know what these original images looked like. So if you've gone out to the Mission Church and you've seen the board up there that has the 12 clans with the images, that's sort of something that's been recaptured. And so this was a quilt that had a lot of the animal totems. Again, you see like the bear, the turtle, beavers. Turtle is quite prevalent. There's several different totems like big turtle, little turtle, river turtle. Going through, I was really enamored with this ceremonial staff. On the top of it is actually a hawk that had been taxidermied on the top of the totem. So this is in their main room in the center, in their gathering room where they tell the stories. And then this was really hard to take a picture of this case, but this is a piece of one of the original Indian Mill dam boards. When they renovated the site in the 1970s and they replaced the old dam, they gave a piece of this to the Wyandotte Nation. There's a piece of the Mission Church board up there. And then this knife is one of about a dozen that we know exist. It was made by Burl Wright, who was a knife maker for the Wyandots. And the handle is actually made of wood from the Buckeye tree, one of the roots of the Buckeye tree out at Indian Mill. Back in 2016, when they were cleaning the tree out, there was this one root that just came out and was out of the ground, so then they cut it off. When the Wyandots came back in 2019, they asked if they could have that. And so we gave them, not thinking much. Burl Wright made a series of knives with that wood as the handle. There is one on display in the Wyandotte Cultural Center. We have one here in Upper Sandusky that was made for the Indian Mill. Chief Friend has one on display outside of his office. And there's a few more that were given to some of the other chiefs. And they're considered ceremonial items. They were very important that they wanted to display this. So Burl Wright, I believe, has since passed, so they're not going to be making any more knives in those styles. None are identical. They were all handmade, hand forged. So I should have brought it down. We have it upstairs. If anybody wants to see the knife, I could bring that down later. But that was a really cool connection between the Wyandots out there and the Wyandots here. So that was kind of the end of the day. So I went back to the hotel, had dinner, sat around, watched the TV. I hit the casino for about an hour and then went back. And the next morning I went to the Wyandotte Cultural Center, and I took this picture in the front end, and you can see here the rounded portion. So the inside is all round, and then their little garden area and the fire pits are off to the side. So I went in that day and I met Chris Houck, who is the senior cultural interpreter. This is sort of how I met him. This picture was taken later, but when I went in, they introduced me to him. He was actually finishing up teaching a group of young girls how to make handmade pottery. So he teaches the traditional Wyandot classes to the Wyandot students every day. So this gives you kind of an idea of the classroom that's there. So they do anything from, teach them how to fletch the feathers, to make moccasins, make pottery. And so he spent the day with me, taking me around. We went out started out on a walking tour down around, because the chief wasn't in, or at least we thought the chief wasn't in. We walked from the museum, which was about over in this area, just up the hill to the Bearskin Health and Wellness Center. This is their combination. It's like a hospital, has a pharmacy, has a gymnasium, has a swimming pool, has an exercise facility. So it has an urgent care. So if you're a tribal citizen, you go in there, see the doctor. Before you leave the building, you picked up your medication. If they prescribe physical therapy, you just walk right down the hallway to the physical therapist. And so we walked through there, and he was showing me all the places. We said, well, I wonder if Kelly's in. And for those of you who aren't familiar, Kelly Friend, Chief Friend's wife, is one of the leaders of the Wellness Center. So we went into her office and chatted with her for a bit and said, unfortunately, I didn't get to see the chief, but I wanted to at least say hello to you. And she's like, well, you know what? Chief got in late last night. I made him come to work today. He's over in his office. So I got to go over and actually visit with Chief Friend. And one of the things that he had on his wall was from about 2017. He was the primary speaker for a Native American Day on Fort Riley, Kansas. He said, I have no idea how they got my name, but they called me up and they wanted me to be the primary speaker. So he has this big plaque. Of course, I served with the 1st Infantry Division, the big red one. So of course my eyes are drawn right to that. But we talked quite a bit about that. We talked about their coming back to Ohio. He's actually going to be in town this weekend speaking at the John Stewart Church across the street. So we, talked quite a bit about the history of the Wyandots and just some of the things that I was doing out here, some of the changes we made. One of the big ones, and I've changed some of the exhibits that we have based on conversation with the Wyandots. About a year ago, when Chief Friend and some of the Wyandots were out here, there is the story of Bill Moose, the reported last full-blooded Wyandot that is buried in Worthington, Ohio. And he said, we've researched and there is no connection that we can find for Bill Moose being a Wyandot. But he was supposedly lived over 110 years old, and he was an Indian for the Sells Brothers Circus. So he made a living as a, quote, Indian, the last full-blooded Wyandot. Although one of the postcards that was found of him says his name was alias Crowfeet. And he claimed to be Wyandot. Well, the Wyandots looked through all of their sources, could not find anything. So a chief friend asked me to take down the 2 panels about Bill Moose that we had on display. And I've done that for a few other things that they've asked us to do, because as I told him, what we wanted to do is respectful of the Wyandots, and part of my reason for being out here is to learn the stories so that I can more accurately tell your history in Ohio. And he said, well, you know what, that's kind of funny, because what most people do not get through their heads, we've been in Oklahoma longer than we were ever in Ohio.
Oh, yeah.
He said, Oklahoma is our home. He said, yes, we were in Upper Sandusky for about 25, 30 years. We've been out here for 130 years. He said, that's what people don't realize, that we've been out west longer than we were ever in Ohio. He said, but the problem is that in Oklahoma, they don't teach about our time in any other state before we come out here. The Wyandots just miraculously arrived, you know, in 1867. Poof! There's a Wyandot nation in Oklahoma. Never anywhere else. He said, so that's why we take the interns back to Ohio, to where we came from, so they can learn. He said, we come to Ohio, we go to Wyandotte County, we go to Fairfield County to the Leather Lips, we go up to Michigan to the 6 Points to meet with the Wyandots, up there in Michigan, the Wyandotte tribe, and he said that way they know where they came from. He said, and a lot of people don't realize, he said, my ancestors are from Michigan, what is now the Wyandotte tribe. Everybody assumes they went from Ohio to Kansas. He said, but there were ones that came from Michigan down to Upper Sandusky, went out with them. He said, those were some of my ancestors. So we sat and we talked for probably an hour in his office, and then Chris decided to take me on a driving tour. So we drove around the Wyandot Nation. One of the things he showed me was they had just built a brand new True Value hardware store. He said the closest hardware store is at least a 50-mile drive, so we got a franchise and we built our own hardware store. Across the road from the casino is a combination Family Dollar, Dollar Tree, Dollar General. So neither one of them, I've never seen that before, but they said they all wanted to come, but instead of granting the rights to one, they let them all. So it's right there, and it's a little shopping strip of the dollar stores.
Oh, my word.
They have room for a 5 and dime?
They may. So, and then they had the big gas station, the Turtle Stop, which they're now franchised. They have Turtle Stops in Oklahoma, Missouri, and they just opened one up in Kansas because I think it was around the Park City, Kansas. They bought a brand new hotel and completely renovated it, and they're turning it into a resort area. They're going to build a casino up there, and they've got their own gas stations that they go along with it. And so inside the gas station, the Turtle Stop was the original Little Turtle Casino, the bingo parlor, and where they got their start, where they had their first games. And you could probably put that little casino inside this room. But that's what got them started. They said now there are over 570 recognized nations in the United States, and about 100 of those have casinos. The Wyandots actually maintain about 5 different casinos. And so they share some in Oklahoma, but the River Bend is their main casino in Wyandotte, and Little Turtle. They have the 7th Street Casino in downtown Kansas City. So we took a drive around, and he drove me through the residential area, when the elders come back, they build houses for them to live in. And so I was asking him about how they get built. And right now, they hire construction crews in, but they're thinking of starting their own construction business because to work in a casino, you have to have a clean record. He said, unfortunately, a lot of our young men and women, to a degree, don't have that background where they didn't get in trouble at least some point. So they can't get a gaming license, so there's not much jobs. Hence, the True Value hardware store, the dollar stores, working as interns on the reservation. He said, but if we start a construction firm, they can build the homes of their parents and grandparents, and that can instill that sense of pride and honor in them. So we went through there, and they actually bought a section of land outside of the reservation, or I mean the tribal jurisdiction area, and they are building a housing development. They own the land, but you can actually lease the land and build your own house on it. So it looks like any kind of housing development that you'd see anywhere else in the country, but it's on Wyandot land. And then he said, you're one of the first people that have been back here. They bought a brand new farm that they had just recently acquired, this farm that had been in several generations of a non-tribal citizen just alongside the land. They said, we want to raise our own cattle and sheep and process it so we have fresh beef in the casino. He said, and we just bought this a few months ago. He said, so nobody else has really been out here other than the old ranch hands. So I got to be one of the first non-tribal citizens to go down through the new ranch area. So that was, a fun little drive, a couple hours driving. And so Chris is telling me all these different stories, and then it's late in the day, so we stopped. He's like, do you want to go have a late lunch? I said, sure. So we went into the little deli inside the casino and ate. So there is really no other place to eat there. The breakfast and the lunch are in the little deli in the casino, and then they have the restaurant in the casino. Other than that, they traditionally make their meals at home. There's not really much else. So there's no real, yes.
Did you get a sense of how many people actually live
It's probably around 300 to 500 people.
in that reservation?
They have over 7,500 tribal citizens, but they're scattered all across the United States.
Okay.
But there's only a couple hundred that actually live. They said, and they're building more houses because a lot of their elders that are maybe living in California, Washington, Illinois, they're starting to come back to Wyandot, Oklahoma when they get retirement age, because when they get there, they would build them a house. They have free meals provided for them, all their health care, inside they had a new recreation center, so if they wanted to play pool, foosball, even video games, they said, believe it or not, some of our elders are that generation where they were playing video games when they were younger.
Yeah.
And so they have all of these amenities, so it's becoming a little retirement community. So we need to build more and more houses. And they even had a little tiny house section, and that was set aside specifically, and it was a restricted area just for like battered wives, women or children trying to avoid domestic situations. And it was in a separate area where it was maintained by the jurisdictional police. And so that if a lady asked for help with her and her children, they would provide her a free place to live and then protection to make sure that no one came. So that was another aspect of them taking care of their own people that I really didn't know about. And he said, we're not going to go down that road, but you can see the tiny houses from a distance. And it was just all kinds of different ones, whether it was be a single mother or it'd be a family of 5, or it'd be maybe an elderly lady who, just needed a place to get away. So, I drove through, and so I got to spend a lot of time, and they invited me to come back, so they want me to come back, make it an annual trip. So So this was another place that we passed. This is the little city hall building in Wyandot, Oklahoma. I showed you one other picture of the fire station. So just tiny little buildings there. And so when I got ready to leave Wyandot, I already taken pictures of the entering and exit Wyandot. Am I running late on time?
10 minutes.
Okay. So, and we haven't even got to Kansas yet. So, just outside of the Wyandotte Nation is the Grand Lake State Park. This borders a lot of the Wyandot land, so it's good hunting and fishing land right along there. And it's actually a Oklahoma State Park that is maintained in part by the Wyandotte Nation. So I took the long drive up to Kansas to Bonner Springs. It's about a 2.5 hour drive straight north out of Oklahoma. And you go through the Pawnee Nation and a couple other nations on the way up. And so I got to the Wyandotte County Museum and I checked in and I introduced myself as the curator of the Wyandotte County Museum. I was here to visit the Wyandotte County Museum. And so the gentleman that was there said, well, I'm not actually the curator. He goes, normally I'm the sexton for the local cemetery. I've got 2 weeks till I retire, so I'm just in here. He said, so look around, do whatever you want. And I was like, I like some of those maps and those shirts and stuff. How much are they? He goes, oh, if you want them, here, take them. Take whatever you want. So he gave me lots of postcards and brochures and all kinds of other information about the Wyandotte County Museum. So the original building was built in 1962 in the middle of the city park in Bonner Springs, and then they added a huge addition in 92. A lot of markers outside. This one of the Kansas Indian Reservation talks about where south of that area was where the Wyandots were located in the area present day Kansas City. So, in the museum, they've got all kinds of different displays. I'm just going to show a few of the images. So here is their big section on the Wyandot tribe. They had one on the Wyandots, one in the Delaware, one in the Shawnee, because they all kind of settled in this area. So I kind of focused on the Wyandot Nation. They actually have the Wyandot Nation of Kansas logo there. So that's who they primarily work with. And so some close-ups of the displays, including some moccasins and some traditional headdress, a tobacco pouch, and this is a close-up of the tobacco pouch here. And this was actually owned by this gentleman, William Walker. William Walker Jr. came from Upper Sandusky with the Wyandots. When they settled out there, William Walker was elected first governor of the Kansas Territory. So a lot of people don't know that a Wyandot Indian was the governor of the state. But a lot of their pieces are on display, and they said in the 1850s and the 1860s, when they fell on hard times, they sold most of the items that they took with them to Ohio, whether it was to anthropologists from the Smithsonian, Kansas State Museum, the Wyandotte County Historical Society. So a lot of this, in order to feed their families, they sold these pieces off. So there's very little of their heritage that they actually have access to today. And so in addition to all this moving around, not only did they lose their cultural artifacts, they lost their language, they lost a lot of their traditions, their ceremonies, and they only started to try to reclaim that in the 1970s. So if you think from the 1860s to the 1970s, you've got over 100 years of non-native speakers and the traditional ceremonies that they had lost. As was another display they had that I always loved telling the story, and when I was out there I wanted to see it for myself. So this is a little display about the Conley sisters and Fort Conley. Fort Conley, when the Huron Cemetery, when the Wyandots went out in the 1840s, there was a big cholera epidemic in the 1850s. And so about 2/3 of the tribe passed away, and they were buried in the Huron Cemetery. In later years, developers decided, after the Wyandots were moved out either to western Kansas or down to Oklahoma, that we want this area, this is really great land in downtown Kansas City. So they wanted it, so the Connolly sisters decided that they would protect it. So this is the shotgun, there is the sisters. And I'll show this a little bit better when we get into another image. But they built a little shack above their parents' graves. And anytime the developers showed up with vehicles, one of the sisters, they took turns sleeping. So they took that little double barrel shotgun, put it out the window, and fired a few shots at the bulldozers or the workmen until they decided it was time to leave. And this court case went on up until the 1990s. It wasn't until the Supreme Court decided that it was consecrated land in about 1994 that they finally stopped trying to develop it. So I'll mention a couple other things as we get to that. They had great archaeological displays. I loved this poster up here that had all kinds of different points and stuff and how to identify them. Again, this is where I took dozens and dozens of photographs through that. I had some free time after leaving before I went to the hotel. I'm only an hour and a half away from Fort Riley, Kansas, where I was stationed. And I hadn't been out there since the late 1990s. I was on Fort Riley from 89 to 91. So I drove out there and they had the little reception area. So you have to go in and get a pass to go on. So I went in there to the reception area and I'm wearing my 1st Infantry Division hat. And so I asked them about getting a pass. And so they wanted my military ID. They said, are you a veteran? I said, yes. So I pulled out my VA card. They took that in my driver's license to process. In the meantime, several other people, like a couple Uber drivers came in, and a guy came in with his girlfriend, and they said, well, you want like a 1-day pass or a 3-day pass, or, you know, the driver got a 30-day pass. And so we're sitting about 20 minutes later, the whole room is filling up, everybody waiting, and the lady calls my name from behind, she hands me my driver's license, PA, said, just show this to the gate, have the guard scan it. You're good for a year from now. You can come in and out as much as you want. And everybody started turning and looked at me like, why is this guy so special? So I pulled out, I'd been sitting on my lap, I put my 1st Infantry Division veteran hat on there, all like, oh. So I guess you're special because you served. So I went and drove around. They had a brand new entrance area, Fort Riley. This is the little Victory. That was the headquarters company lapel pin that I would wear. So that was kind of exciting to see that. So one of the M1 Abrams tanks from Desert Storm that was sitting there welcoming people to the airfield. And then this was the barracks where I used to live in. This was the way it looks now. It looks a lot nicer than when I was there because it is now housing for dignitaries. So it has now turned into little mini apartments rather than the barracks. And Rob would know how just horrible plain those barracks were. But I took this picture and there were a few people in these cars over here staring like, who is this guy and why is he taking pictures? Well, I wanted a picture because I was there then. One of the last times I was at this building, we were lined up to go to Desert Storm. So I was there, and then this was, I took a close-up of the front, and I noticed quite a few changes to Gillis Hall. So this, we came back in 91. So none of the trees are there. This is all spruced up and cleaned up out front. So it was kind of exciting to kind of go back. I went to the 1st Infantry Division Museum. I went out there, I got there around June 11th. They were renovating the museums and the grand opening was on the 13th. So I had to be outside. So of course I had to take the selfie to go on to post. And the U.S. Cavalry Museum there, you can still see the renovation dumpsters. So they were just finishing up the renovations. So the workers were there staring at me. So I was taking pictures of all the vehicles and stuff outside of the buildings And so I drove around, spent about an hour and a half, and I'm like, you know what? It's almost 7:30. I've got to go check into the hotel, which is an hour the other way back in Kansas City. So I I took a couple more pictures. So this was the old movie theater. It's now a coffee shop on base. This is where I saw the movie Die Hard for the first time. I fell in love with Bruce Willis. I must have watched the movie 20 times in that little theater. So, and then the little railway station from when this was Junction City, back in the 1910s. This is where the soldiers came in. They departed on the rail line into this little depot or transitioned in. We had an intake building. One of the reasons I wanted to take this is because back in 1918, in the other part of Fort Riley, Camp Funston, when the soldiers were gathered there, some of the soldiers came down with the influenza. So one of the stories of how the Spanish flu started was some of the soldiers that got sick at Camp Funston on Fort Riley and then were shipped east to New York and Philadelphia to get on the ships to go overseas, and then they started infecting these guys that were okay, but they were carriers, and they infected the soldiers going overseas, and then when they got to Europe, it just blossomed. So I can kind of say that I served where the potential start of the Spanish flu was. So I went back the next day. When I had been to the Wyandotte County Museum, I met with the Kansas Delaware Tribe of Indians. Their tribal council was setting up there in the museum. And so the gentleman that was in charge introduced me to the chief and the second chief. And they said, well, we're having our annual meeting tomorrow. And they said, we don't have any business cards. So if you want to come back, we'll give you a business card and we can chat later. So I went back, I waited till they had their smoking ceremonies and all their photographs taken out front. And the chief said, well, instead of just getting the card, why don't you come join us for the day? So I sat in on the whole meeting that day. And I don't know if anybody can spot me in the photo. They sat me at the table where I'm hiding behind the plants. They were selling plants, and so this one family bought a whole bunch of them. I just happened to, they had an empty spot there, so they sat me. So all around the room, there were all these little signs about how to speak Lenape. So I was there and got immersed in the Lenape or the Delaware culture. And what was interesting is I was talking to someone, they were not aware that there was a Delaware reservation in Wyandotte County. When the massacre happened in Nantucket in the early 1700s, the Delaware split. The ones that were out in Kansas that I talked to went from Ohio out to Indiana. There was a group that went from northeast to northwest Ohio. They left here in 1829 and went to Canada. So I'm out there telling the Delaware some of their stories, their history. And so that meant quite a bit. But they were teaching me some of the Lenape culture. So different words like come in, temite. The one that I found the easiest to remember, coffee, coupe. So in the morning, it's like, if you can't quite pronounce coffee and you're just saying, coupe, you're actually speaking Lenape. So I thought that was kind of interesting. Then they actually had a test for us at the end of the meeting. And they had all these words and you had to match them up. So like, we're going to find out if anybody looked at any of these signs around. So then I got to meet the principal chief, Linda Graff, of the Kansas Delaware Tribe of Indians. And Sarah laughed when she saw this picture and like, yes, she is that small because I had to bend over to get into the picture with her. So, yeah, but she is a firehouse, and but anybody got out of line in that, all she had to do was just stop speaking, and everybody was like, okay. So it was a really fun time to actually spend there and get to meet some of the Delaware, spend the day with them, which was kind of unexpected. I wanted to meet with Chief Judith Manthe of the Kansas Nation, the Wyandot Nation. However, she was actually teaching a Wyandot moccasin class for tribal citizens only, so I was not invited to meet with her that day, but it gives me another reason to go back out. So kind of the last stop after I left that meeting, I was heading out of Bonner Springs and I had to go through Kansas City. And so I took a little slight detour to go to the Huron Indian Cemetery, which is in downtown Kansas City. It's on this little side street. Back behind is the 7th Street Casino. So when they were thinking of building a casino in Kansas City, this was at the time that the developers were thinking of utilizing the cemetery. And they said, well, we're not going to allow you to bulldoze it. One of the ideas that was proposed was, we'll just build a pier, a glass floor, and build a casino over top of the cemetery. They didn't understand why the Wyandottes didn't think that was a great idea. So the cemetery, it's a National Historic Site. I expected this really big cemetery full of lots of monuments because it had been fought over for so long. And you get there, and it's just sporadic. There's just a few stones. Most of them are busted and broken because developers trying to remove the traces of the Indian heritage. You have a couple little plaques that say, to the best of my recollection, there are 200 Wyandots that died during the epidemic buried on this ground. Their whereabouts are unknown. They've tried ground penetrating radar, but it's just been so long that they couldn't find anything. So these are some of the Conley stones that survived. These are later stones that were put in. So this is Ida, one of the sisters, and there's the mother, Eliza, and there is the father and a couple of the other sisters. So this was the area around where they built Fort Conley. So this was the little fort in the cemetery. There are two of the sisters. They have a little sign out there, trespassers beware. So this was a little shack, and you could see some of the area around. So anybody would come, they would shoot them. This area, which I'm thinking is this huge cemetery they're fighting over, is probably about the size of the parking lot of the John Stewart Church. So this, I took a picture of where Fort Conley would sit, looking down the hill, kind of the same direction where all the development is today. So this is basically back behind a building just on a little side street. So that was kind of my last thing. So once I left there, then I was like, well, I guess I have to go back to work. So I drove back, spent the night in Illinois, then ended back up here with a lot of souvenirs, a lot of things to take with me. So this is another view of the cemetery as I would leave. I parked my car on this little side street, which I was nervous the whole 10 minutes I was in the cemetery because it's right downtown and you get up into the hill, it's covered behind these buildings. So you can't see your vehicle where it's parked on the main street. I have my computers, everything else, suitcases with me, all just sitting in my vehicle. But this is a little reception area outside, and these 12 bronze plaques all tell the story of the Wyandot Nation and their travels from Canada through Oklahoma, and then each of these little medallions up top also represent one of the animal totems. So I brought a few things with me. So out there, one of the big shirts they always have, Think Wyandot. Yeah, so I want to say, as the Wyandots would, Tisme, or thank you, or I will also say, Wanishi. This was a present from the Delaware. So Wanishi, thank you. Tisme Wanishi.
Hey.
I appreciate you attending tonight. Any questions? I don't know how long I went on, but like I said, I probably took 500 pictures, so we could be here a couple hours. Just the pictures of the museum alone, just the look, even the single room, there's probably a dozen more. They had all kinds of display cases in there. There were also cases with history of the Seneca Indian school that were there, but that was not something I really kind of focused on. This was kind of later. But we did get to talk with the chief, and he explained a lot about the removal of the children and how they were housed there, and, you know, the loss of the culture. And that's one of the things that they're encountering up in Michigan with the Wyandotte Androdon. They're trying to get a federal status, federal recognition, but they have to be able to prove their heritage and their ancestry back. Well, in the 1920s and 30s, it was very unpopular to be an Indian because they were afraid the children would get taken. So they're listed either as white or mixed, so that it doesn't actually say Native American or Indian or Wyandot in the census records. So they're having a difficult time trying to prove that. And when the Wyandotte started, they had about 620 citizens left from Ohio. They said about 2/3 died during the cholera epidemic. And initially, to be a citizen, you had to be on the actual roll, or one of your parents be on the roll. Now they've kind of changed the rules because they're getting so many generations away that if you can prove that, you know, an ancestor was on the roll. And I've even talked to, when I was down this weekend, talked to Chief Glenna Wallace, and she was talking about the Eastern Shawnee Nation, how they had got down to literally 29 people in their nation. And so they changed the rules so that if your parent was an enrolled citizen, you don't have to have both parents, but as long as if your father was enrolled, then you can enroll, and if you enroll, then your children enroll. But they said the problem is they're getting to a generation where they don't want to be, quote, Indian, so they're not enrolling. They said, well, if you don't enroll, your children can't enroll. And so all of a sudden our numbers had gone up and they're going back down. So the Wyandottes are experiencing this. They've raised up to about 7,500, but they're scattered all around, and they're just worried about the next generation or two being so far removed from Wyandotte, Oklahoma, or Wyandotte, Kansas, that it's not meaning as much to be a Wyandotte citizen. And so they're, you know, worried about those numbers going back down. They said, the one thing to remember that he said 99% of the people studying do not realize that the teachers, the Indians did not die off when they left Ohio. He said that's the one thing that we're combating is we just miraculously appeared in Oklahoma. Where we came from, nobody knows. He said, but when they left Ohio, we all of a sudden we fell off the face of the earth. All our nations died. He said, so that's, you know, one of the things that we're combating. And that's one of the reasons why I wanted to go out there and immerse myself in their cultures, to kind of share those stories and let them know, you know, that we know that they are still here, and we want the words and the actions of the Wyandottes to echo through Wyandotte County, Ohio for generations to come.
Well, thanks, Ron. Thank you for being a friend to the Wyandottes. We appreciate, all of us here at the museum and Upper and in this area, we appreciate that.
You bet.
Thank you.
Thank you.